The temperature in Anchorage that evening was 19 degrees Fahrenheit. I know that because I stood in it for 47 minutes without moving, and by the time I finally accepted what had happened, I could no longer feel my fingers inside my dress gloves. The parking lot outside the Diener Civic and Convention Center was emptying fast. Families loading into warm cars, professors shaking hands, clusters of graduates laughing and taking photos under the amber glow of the streetlights. I watched all of it from the far edge of the lot, still wearing my master's gown over the charcoal suit I had spent 3 weeks pay on, holding a rolled diploma I had not yet bothered to look at. Row G, seats 14 and 15. I had reserved them 8 weeks in advance. I had mailed the confirmation to their home address in Wasilla. I had called my mother twice in the final week to confirm, both times getting the enthusiastic response that made me feel, briefly, like a child who still believed his parents would show up when they said they would. They did not show up. I had scanned the auditorium from the stage during the processional, squinting against the stage lights, searching for my father's broad shoulders and my mother's silver-streaked hair. Row G, seats 14 and 15 were occupied by a stranger's parents, a couple I did not recognize who had taken the unclaimed seats and spent the entire ceremony beaming at someone else's kid. I received my Master of Science in Corporate Audit from the University of Alaska Anchorage with a 3.94 GPA, summa cum laude honors, and not a single person in the audience who was there for me. Standing in that parking lot, I let myself remember the last time something like this had happened. I was 12 years old. My school had an end-of-year track meet. Not the championship, nothing famous, just the kind of afternoon event where parents sat on bleachers and cheered for kids running laps. My mother had promised she would be there. I had been practicing my 400-meter run for 6 weeks. When the time came and I searched the bleachers, I found them empty of her. I stood in the drizzle afterward, waiting for 40 minutes before my coach offered to drive me home. When I walked through our front door, I heard laughter coming from the dining room. My brother Edward was presenting his first business idea to a room full of my parents' friends, a pet-sitting app he had sketched out on notebook paper. He was 16. My parents sat at the head of the table like proud monarchs, my mother pouring wine, my father nodding with the particular expression he saved only for Edward, the kind of expression that said, "This one is going somewhere." I went to my room, took off my track shoes, and put them under my bed. I did not run competitively again. That memory surfaced in the parking lot with the same blunt force it always had, and I let it move through me the way I had learned to do. Acknowledge it, feel its full weight for exactly 30 seconds, then set it down. My therapist, Dr. Reyes, called this completing the emotional loop. She had been helping me work on my boundaries for 2 years, and in the months leading up to graduation, we had talked at length about what I would do if my parents let me down again. I had been clear, I would stop trying. I pulled off my right glove, took out my phone, and scrolled to my contacts. Thomas White. I pressed block. Helen White. I pressed block. Then I slid the phone back into my pocket, picked up the diploma tube from the cold asphalt where I had set it down, and walked to my car. For 4 days, I felt something I had never allowed myself to feel before. Relief. The silence where their numbers used to be was not painful. It was clean. I slept well. I went to work at my accounting firm, fielded congratulations from colleagues, started drafting the outline for a financial forensic certification I had been putting off. I made myself a real dinner every night instead of eating crackers over my kitchen sink. I called Dr. Reyes and told her what I had done, and she said in her careful, measured way, "How does that feel?" Like I finally closed a tab that had been open for 20 years. I told her. On the morning of the 4th day, my office phone rang. Unknown number, Alaska area code. Is this Arthur White? A woman's voice, professional and careful in the way that immediately tightens your stomach. This is Nurse Coordinator Deborah Marsh at Providence, Alaska Medical Center. I'm calling about Thomas and Helen White. You're listed as their emergency contact. I do not remember the drive to the hospital. I remember parking. I remember the automatic doors of the ICU wing opening with a mechanical hiss. I remember the smell, antiseptic and recycled air, and something underneath both of those things that hospitals always carry. the smell of people fighting to stay alive in rooms with fluorescent lighting. Nurse Marsh met me in the corridor and walked me through the situation in the brisk, compassionate shorthand that medical professionals develop after years of delivering bad news to strangers. My father, Thomas, had suffered a traumatic brain injury and 3 broken ribs from the initial impact. He was intubated, sedated, and would remain on the ventilator for at least 72 hours while the swelling in his brain was monitored. My mother, Helen, had a C4-C5 cervical compression fracture. She was in a rigid collar, could not turn her head, and was on a strict no-movement protocol. She was conscious. She was asking for me. The guilt hit me so hard I had to stop walking for a moment, bracing one hand against the corridor wall. The voice in my head, the one I had been trying to quiet for years, started immediately. You blocked their numbers, you selfish son. Your parents could have died trying to reach you. For days of silence while they were broken open in a ditch somewhere. I breathed through it. I followed Nurse Marsh through the double doors. My father looked smaller in the hospital bed than he had ever looked in my life. Thomas White was a big man. 6'2", former army mechanic, hands like sledgehammers. Seeing him lying with tubes running into his arms and a ventilator doing the work his lungs were supposed to do made something collapse quietly inside me. Whatever anger I had spent 4 days carefully cultivating, it evaporated the moment I saw the rise and fall of his chest driven by a machine. My mother was in the adjacent bay, separated by a curtain that the nurse pulled partway open. Helen's eyes found me the moment I stepped into the room, and she held them there with an intensity that I would not understand until later. Arthur. Her voice was a hiss, barely above a whisper, because even drawing breath too deeply caused pain with her injury. Come close. I pulled a chair to the side of her bed and sat. Her hand found my forearm and gripped it with more strength than I expected from someone in a cervical brace. We are going to be okay, she said. For words, we are going to be okay. In that moment, sitting in the antiseptic light with my father's ventilator marking time in the next bay, I heard those words as comfort, as a mother reassuring her son that she and her husband would survive. I felt the remaining wall of my 4-day resolve dissolve completely. The emotions I had been managing so carefully, the clean silence, the relief. All of it cracked open, and underneath was the 28-year-old son who had wanted, his entire life, for his parents to show up. I told her I was there. I told her I was going to handle everything. I meant it with every part of myself that was still capable of meaning things unconditionally. I left the hospital that evening with a list in my head. Talk to the billing department, contact their insurance provider, get power of attorney set up so I could manage their accounts while they recovered, reach out to their neighbors in Wasilla to check on the house. I was, in the language my father had always used approvingly about Edward and never about me, stepping up. What I did not understand yet was that I was stepping directly into a trap that had been laid for me with surgical precision, and that my mother's 4 words had not been comfort. They had been confirmation. She had looked me in the eye and told me the secret was safe. The police officer who brought me my parents' personal effects the following morning was a young trooper named Halvorsen, barely older than my students back when I had tutored undergrads. He handed me a clear plastic evidence bag sealed with a custody tag and offered his condolences with the practiced solemnity of someone still learning how to do it. Inside the bag, my father's wallet. My mother's phone, screen shattered, still showing a crack-obscured lock screen. A receipt from a gas station. A pair of reading glasses with one lens cracked. My father's watch, the Seiko he had worn since before I was born, with the small dent in the case from a deployment accident he never fully explained. And, folded into quarters in my father's shirt pocket, a copy of the accident report. I signed for the bag, thanked Trooper Halvorsen, and sat in my car in the hospital parking structure to read the report. I do not know what I was expecting to find. Maybe some information about the other driver, about road conditions, something practical I could pass along to the insurance company. What I found instead was a single line that changed everything. Location of incident: mile marker 115, Seward Highway, southbound. I sat with that for a moment. Then I opened Google Maps on my phone. The Dina Ina Center, where my graduation had taken place, is in downtown Anchorage. My parents live in Wasilla, northeast of Anchorage, roughly an hour's drive. The Seward Highway runs south from Anchorage toward the Kenai Peninsula. Mile marker 115 is approximately 3.5 hours south of the city, deep into the peninsula, in the direction of the coastal towns near Resurrection Bay. My graduation had been at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. The accident occurred, according to the timestamp on the report, at 6:47 in the evening. My parents had not been driving to my graduation. They had not missed it because of traffic or a family emergency or any of the vague reasons I had half-constructed in my head during those 4 days. They had not been anywhere near the university. At 6:47 in the evening, while I was eating alone at a restaurant downtown to celebrate my own degree, my parents were 3.5 hours in the opposite direction, driving toward the coast at a speed that the report described as inconsistent with posted limits for road conditions. They were running. I did not know yet what they were running from, but I knew, with the cold certainty that comes not from emotion but from data, that my parents had never had any intention of attending my graduation. The empty seats in row G had not been a last-minute failure. They had been scheduled. I folded the accident report back into quarters. I put it in the inside pocket of my jacket, against my chest. Then I drove to the hospital to retrieve the personal items they had asked me to bring from their house in Wasilla, which meant I now had keys to their home. And, because I was who I was, because I had spent 6 years training myself to follow the evidence wherever it led, I drove to Wasilla with my mind completely, carefully, professionally open. My parents' house in Wasilla was a 2-story colonial on a quarter-acre lot, the kind of house that looks comfortable from the outside and gives you, the moment you step through the front door, the sense that something is subtly wrong. It was too quiet, the kind of quiet that comes not from absence but from held breath. I collected what they had asked for: Helen's medications, Thomas's phone charger, a set of clean clothes each. I moved through the house methodically, and I might have left without looking further if I had not noticed my father's laptop sitting open on the kitchen table, its screen still showing the tail end of an active session, the battery indicator blinking orange. I sat down in front of it. The session had timed out and relocked. The password prompt blinked at me. I sat there for perhaps 10 seconds. In 12 years of working in audit and forensic accounting, I had developed what colleagues sometimes called an uncomfortable intuition about financial irregularities, the ability to feel when numbers were wrong before I could articulate why. That instinct was running at full volume in my father's kitchen, and it was telling me something that my son brain desperately did not want to hear. I typed, Edward_CEO. The screen unlocked. My father had been using my brother's name as his password. This did not surprise me in the way it might have surprised someone else. What surprised me was the email client that opened on the screen, still showing the last thread my father had been reading before he left the house. The thread was titled, Repayment Schedule, Kenai Capital Partners LLC, Urgent. I read for 2 hours. By the end of those 2 hours, I had a complete picture of a financial disaster that had been building for at least 3 years, assembled behind my back with architectural deliberateness. My brother Edward had founded a software startup in Seattle, a B2B logistics platform he had convinced a handful of angel investors to back. The company had been bleeding money for 18 months. What made it catastrophic rather than merely unfortunate was that Edward, rather than acknowledging the losses to his investors, had been falsifying payroll tax submissions to the state of Washington, skimming employee withholding and routing it back into the operating account to manufacture the appearance of solvency. The Washington State Department of Revenue had opened a compliance audit 8 months ago. The exposure was substantial. To prevent the audit from becoming a criminal referral, Edward needed liquid capital. He had gone to our parents. Our parents did not have liquid capital. What they had was the equity in their house, a retirement account, and a parcel of land on the Kenai Peninsula. They had liquidated the retirement account first, $214,000, withdrawn over 6 months in amounts just below the federal reporting threshold. They had executed a cash-out refinance on the house, pulling $180,000 at an adjustable rate. And then, when those amounts proved insufficient, they had gone to a private lending organization based in Seward, a company called Kenai Capital Partners LLC, which operated in the space between hard money lender and something that required considerably more careful description, and borrowed $650,000 at an annual interest rate of 21%, compounding monthly. The collateral my parents had offered for the $650,000 loan was not their house. The house was already refinanced to its ceiling. The collateral was a property they did not own. I found the loan document in a PDF folder my father had labeled, with stunning carelessness, Case of style. I opened it. I scrolled to the collateral section. I read the property description. Parcel 14B, Kenai River frontage, 2.3 acres, including existing structure, cabin construction, cedar frame, river dock. My grandfather's cabin. My grandfather, Raymond White, had been a commercial fisherman on the Kenai for 30 years. He had built that cabin himself in the 1970s, working summers and weekends until it was done. When he died, he had been meticulous about his estate. Unusual for a man of his generation, but Raymond had lived through enough family disputes over property to understand what happened when old men left things vague. He had left specific assets to specific people. The cabin and the land went to me, not to my parents, not to Edward. To me, specifically, with a note in the will that said, in my grandfather's handwriting, Arthur works hard and asks for nothing. This is for him. I had been 22 when Raymond died. I had kept the cabin, visited it when I could, paid the property taxes every year, and never once thought I needed to protect it from my own family. The guarantor line on the Kenai Capital Partners loan document read, Arthur James White. My signature, or something that appeared to be my signature, was on the page. I had never signed this document. I had never seen this document. I had never authorized any person, living or dead, to use my name or my property as collateral for any loan. My parents had forged my signature to borrow $650,000 from a hard money lender in Seward, using my grandfather's cabin as the guarantee. I sat in my father's kitchen chair and did not move for a long time. There was one more thing I needed to check. Among the details in the email chain was a reference I had almost scrolled past. A message from Edward to my father, dated 3 weeks before my graduation, that said, the KCP rep wants a $15,000 processing fee in cash before they'll release the funds. Can you pull from Arthur's collection? He'll never notice until it's done. My grandfather had left me 2 things. The cabin was one. The other was a collection of 37 silver dollars, Morgan and Peace design, minted between 1878 and 1935. Raymond had accumulated them over decades, buying individual coins from estate sales and coin dealers, keeping them in a custom mahogany case lined with velvet. They were not worth a fortune in a strict market sense. A professional appraiser had valued the collection at approximately $22,000 when I had it assessed after his death. But their actual value had nothing to do with money. They were the only physical object I had from the man who was the only adult in my childhood who had treated me as if I were worth something. I kept them in a small wall safe in my apartment, the kind of safe that looks like a standard electrical panel, recessed behind a framed photograph of the Kenai River that my grandfather had taken in 1987. When I had driven home from the hospital 2 nights earlier to pick up a change of clothes, I had noticed, in the distracted way you notice things when your mind is occupied elsewhere, that the photograph was slightly off-center on the wall. I had straightened it automatically and thought nothing of it. Now, sitting in my father's kitchen with a forged loan document on the screen in front of me, I understood what the slightly off-center photograph meant. My parents had been in my apartment. They had keys. I had given them a spare set years ago, in a previous chapter of my life when I had still believed that the right gesture could eventually build the relationship I wanted. I had never asked for the keys back. I drove from Wasilla to my apartment in 18 minutes, which is faster than it should have taken. I went straight to the photograph. I lifted it from the wall. The safe behind it was closed, which meant nothing because the safe used a combination I had never changed from the default, my grandfather's birth year, and anyone who knew Raymond would have known where to start guessing. I entered the combination. The door swung open. The mahogany case was gone. The safe contained a rubber band, a folded piece of paper with an insurance policy number on it, and nothing else. The space where 37 silver dollars had rested in velvet for 6 years was empty. I closed the safe. I replaced the photograph. I sat down on the floor of my own apartment with my back against the wall and remained there for some time. Here is what I want to tell you about that moment because I think it matters for understanding everything that came after. I did not cry. I wanted to. The grief was real. It was not abstract, not the clean analytical grief of discovering financial fraud, but the specific physical grief of knowing that someone had put their hands on the last thing my grandfather had given me and carried it out of my home to trade it for cash. That grief deserved tears, and I acknowledged it. But something had shifted in the 40 minutes since I had read the loan document. The part of my brain that I relied on professionally, the part that did not get emotional, that treated every document as evidence and every inconsistency as a thread to pull, had taken over completely. And that part of my brain was not grieving. It was building a case. I stood up from the floor, went to my kitchen, and made coffee. Then I sat at my own table with a legal pad and started writing down everything I knew, in the order I knew it, with the sources that proved each point. I wrote for 3 hours. By the time I stopped, I had 6 pages of notes and the beginning of a plan that I was not yet certain I was capable of executing. I went to bed at 2 in the morning. I slept for 6 hours without interruption. In the morning, I put on my work clothes, drank another cup of coffee, and called my supervisor to request emergency leave. Then I booked a flight to Seattle. Before I flew to Seattle, I needed to understand exactly what I was facing. I spent 1 full day at my kitchen table with the laptop documents I had photographed on my phone, working through the financial structure the way I would have approached any forensic audit engagement. Methodically, without assumptions, following the money. The picture that emerged was worse than I had initially understood. Kenai Capital Partners LLC, the organization that had issued the $650,000 loan, was not a licensed financial institution. It was a private lending entity registered in the Cayman Islands with a registered agent in Seward. Its interest rate, 21% annually, compounding monthly, would, under normal circumstances, attract scrutiny from Alaska's usury statutes, but because the loan had been structured as a commercial real estate bridge loan rather than a consumer loan, it fell into a regulatory gray area that the company clearly exploited deliberately. The repayment schedule showed that at current rates, the total obligation would exceed $900,000 within 14 months. There was no realistic scenario in which Edwards' company, which, based on the email evidence, was effectively insolvent and under active tax audit, would be able to service this debt. The default was not a possibility. It was a timeline. When the default occurred, Kenai Capital Partners would move to foreclose on the collateral. My grandfather's cabin. My property. The property they had secured using my forged signature. In parallel, if the forgery was ever discovered, and in a foreclosure proceeding it almost certainly would be, I would become the primary subject of investigation because my name was on the document. My career in corporate audit required licensing by the Alaska State Board of Public Accountancy. A financial fraud allegation, even a disputed one, would trigger a board review. The process alone could cost me my license for the duration of the investigation, regardless of outcome. I was looking at the potential loss of my grandfather's property, my professional license, and my livelihood, all engineered by my own family without my knowledge, while I was finishing my master's degree and reserving them seats at my graduation. I mapped all of this on the legal pad. Then I turned the page and wrote 3 headings. Immediate, medium term, long term. Under immediate, I wrote, document everything, secure my identity, protect the cabin. Under medium term, understand Edwards' full exposure, gather evidence of the forgery, establish legal standing. Under long term, determine consequences and execute. I booked the flight. I called a lawyer, not a general practice attorney, but a specific person, Miriam Tan, who had been a financial fraud prosecutor for the Alaska AG's office before going into private practice and who I had met twice at professional association events. I left her a voicemail that was careful and specific, because I knew she would call back based on the details. She called back within the hour. Tell me what you have, she said, and I told her. And when I finished, there was a pause on her end that I recognized as the pause of someone recalibrating their afternoon schedule. Get me copies of everything you photographed, she said. And Arthur, do not talk to your parents. Not about any of this. Not until we've met. I told her I understood. I picked up my overnight bag and drove to the airport. Edward's company, Meridian Stack Solutions, had occupied the 4th floor of a converted warehouse in Seattle's Soto district. I found the address from a business registration filing I pulled on my phone during the cab ride from SeaTac. When I arrived, the building's directory still showed Meridian Stack on the 4th floor, but the elevator opened onto a space that had been emptied recently enough that rectangular shadows on the hardwood floors still showed where the furniture had been. A notice from King County Superior Court was taped to the interior of the glass entrance door, a commercial eviction order, dated 11 days prior. I photographed everything. The notice, the empty floor, the shadows where desks had been. Then I took the elevator back down and got back into the cab. Edward's apartment was in a building in Belltown, 12 floors up, with a partial view of Puget Sound. He answered the door in a silk pajama shirt and linen trousers, holding an espresso cup, wearing the expression of someone who had been interrupted during something important. He was 32 years old, 3 inches taller than me, with our father's jaw and our mother's eyes, and he had always had the particular quality of seeming more substantial than he actually was. A skill I recognized as charisma and had spent years watching him deploy on our parents to devastating effect. Arthur. He stepped back to let me in, not warmly. This is a surprise. I was in the area, I said. The apartment was expensive, the kind of expensive that costs money to look effortless, with clean lines and artwork and a kitchen that had clearly never been used seriously. On the marble island, between an opened MacBook and an empty coffee mug, was a stack of papers. I clocked the papers in my peripheral vision the way I would have clocked an anomaly in a balance sheet, without looking directly at them, filing their existence. How are they? Edward asked, moving to the coffee machine with his back to me. Dad is still on the ventilator. Mom has a cervical fracture. Right? He refilled his cup. It's just, the timing is catastrophic. I need certain things to move forward with the restructuring. And with Dad in a coma and Mom not able to sign anything. What things? I asked. He turned around. Something crossed his face. A recalibration, quick and smooth. It's complicated, he said. Business stuff. You wouldn't. His phone rang. He glanced at the screen and his jaw tightened. I have to take this. He walked to the far side of the apartment, toward the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the sound, and began speaking in a low, controlled voice that had the cadence of someone managing a person they considered beneath them. I moved to the kitchen island. The papers were what I had hoped they would be. The top sheet was a demand letter from Kenai Capital Partners addressed to Arthur James White, guarantor, noting that the primary borrowers, Thomas and Helen White, had missed the first scheduled payment and that as guarantor, I was now personally liable for the outstanding balance, currently $667,240 with accruing interest. The second sheet was an internal memo, handwritten in what I recognized as Edward's compressed, leftward-tilting script, outlining a timeline. Get Arthur to sign POA access his accounts settle KCP close audit exposure. He knew. He had always known. Not just that the forgery had happened, he had designed the sequence. My parents had been the hands, but Edward had been the architect. I photographed every page. I was on the last one when he came back from the windows. Sorry about that, he said. Where were we? You were about to tell me it was complicated. I said. Right? He took a long sip of espresso, watching me over the rim of the cup. It is. I put my phone in my pocket. I'm going to head to the hospital, I said. Text me if you need anything. He said he would. He was lying. I knew it. He knew that I knew it, and he was good enough at what he did that he didn't show any concern about it. Edward had always been several moves ahead in every game he played. The difference was that this time, I had already finished the board. I flew back to Anchorage that night and spent the following 72 hours executing what I had outlined on my legal pad with the focused efficiency of someone who has decided that grief is a luxury they cannot afford yet. First, my credit. I contacted all 3 major bureaus and placed a security freeze on my credit file, citing active identity theft, because that was precisely what it was. I filed a complaint with the FTC's Identity Theft Division, attaching photographs of the forged loan document and the demand letter as supporting evidence. I flagged my Social Security number with the IRS. I sent written notification to the Alaska Department of Revenue. I was systematic and thorough in the way that only someone who has spent 6 years examining fraud cases can be, because I had seen exactly how difficult it was to unwind identity theft that had been allowed to proceed unchallenged, and I had no intention of letting this become that kind of case. Second, Edward's financial infrastructure. I had, from the documents I photographed at his apartment and his evicted office, sufficient information to identify the 2 remaining financial institutions through which he was attempting to route funds: a business checking account at a regional bank and a payment processing account through a fintech platform. I contacted the fraud departments of both organizations directly, as a private individual with documented evidence of financial fraud, and submitted formal complaints. Both accounts were frozen within 48 hours. I received confirmation emails that I saved to a dedicated folder, organized by date and source. Third, and most importantly, the cabin. I met with Miriam Tan in her downtown Anchorage office on a Tuesday afternoon. She was a compact woman in her 50s who wore reading glasses on a chain and had the manner of someone who had heard most things and been surprised by very few of them. She reviewed the documents I had brought: the photographed loan agreement, the forged signature, the accident report, the email chain from my father's laptop, and said nothing for a long time. "The forgery is clear," she said finally. "The signature doesn't match your samples. I can see it already, and a handwriting examiner will confirm it definitively. The question is the property." "They used my property as collateral without my knowledge or consent," I said. "The loan is void." "Yes," she said, "but voiding it requires a proceeding which takes time, and Kenai Capital Partners will resist. What I recommend is that we move immediately to establish a protective trust." She walked me through the structure: an irrevocable living trust in the name of Raymond White Legacy Trust, my grandfather's name, into which the cabin property would be transferred. As the settler and sole beneficiary, I would be protected by a spendthrift provision that made the trust assets unreachable by third-party creditors, including Kenai Capital Partners, even if the loan proceeding dragged on. The trust, once established, would also provide grounds for an immediate injunction against any foreclosure action. We filed the trust documents that afternoon. The property transfer was recorded the following morning. By the time my parents were discharged from acute care and moved to a rehabilitation facility, my grandfather's cabin was legally unreachable. It existed inside a structure that had taken Raymond White's name and been made, as completely as the law allowed, permanent. I visited the hospital each day. I brought my mother the books she asked for, helped my father with physical therapy exercises when he was lucid enough to attempt them. I answered their questions about insurance paperwork. I smiled at appropriate moments. I said, when they asked about the future, that everything was going to be fine. I was, in every visible way, the dependable son they had always taken for granted. Inside, I was waiting for the recording. The insurance adjuster's email arrived on a Wednesday morning, flagged as containing an attachment from their vehicle forensics division. The subject line read, "White, claim #AK, 2241B, audio file extract, dashboard camera." The accident had been violent enough to total my parents' car, but the dashcam unit had survived, mounted as it was to the windshield frame with a shock-resistant housing. The insurance company had recovered the footage as part of their standard claims process and was sharing the audio extract with me as the authorized account manager, per the power of attorney I had established. I downloaded the file. I put in my earphones. I listened alone at my kitchen table, in the same chair where I had sat 2 weeks earlier and built the case that was now almost complete. The audio quality was imperfect: road noise, the hum of the heater, the occasional tick of gravel against the undercarriage. My parents' voices were compressed and tinny through the dashcam microphone, but entirely intelligible. They had been arguing. My father's voice came first, and hearing it, the voice of a man who was now in a rehabilitation facility relearning how to form sentences clearly, was the hardest part of those 3 minutes of audio. Thomas had always been the quieter of the two, the one who deferred, who let my mother's decisiveness carry the family's direction. He was deferring here too, but there was something underneath it that I had never heard from him before. A thin, fraying guilt. "We should not have forged Arthur's name," he said. His voice had the quality of someone repeating something for the third or fourth time, someone who had been making the same argument for miles and getting nowhere. "Helen, we should not have done it." My mother's response was immediate, without hesitation. "It's done. They took his coins, Helen." A pause. The sound of wind, the highway, distance. "We took his grandfather's coins. It was necessary." Her voice was flat, matter-of-fact, the voice I recognized from 100 childhood moments. The voice that meant the decision had been made and discussion was the same as weakness. "Arthur will never know. By the time this is resolved, Edward will pay it back." "You know Edward." "I know Edward," my father said, and the way he said it, the particular flatness of it, told me that Thomas White, somewhere in the long years of prioritizing one son over the other, had arrived at a knowledge of Edward that he could not speak aloud to my mother and would not. "Stop," she said, and then, with the precision of someone closing a subject, "Take the money, pay the bank, save Edward. Arthur will never know. Stop whining and drive." There was a pause of perhaps 4 seconds. Then the sound of the road, the heater, my father not speaking. Then the sound that ended everything. A sharp, percussive impact, the tearing of metal, a short cry from my mother, and then static. I took out the earphones. I sat at the kitchen table for a long time. I thought about my father's voice, the guilt in it, the repetition, the "we took his coins" that meant he had been living with that specific fact and could not set it down. I thought about what it cost him, in whatever remained of his moral accounting, to say that to my mother in the car, knowing she would override him and say it anyway. It did not change what he had done. It did not undo the forgery or return the coins. But I filed it the way I filed everything, not as exoneration but as data. A human being had sat in that car and known what he had done was wrong. I saved the audio file to 3 separate encrypted locations. Then I called Miriam Tan and told her I had something she needed to hear. My parents were transferred to a long-term rehabilitation facility in mid-February. My father was making steady progress. He had been extubated, was speaking in full sentences, and had begun outpatient physical therapy for his motor coordination. My mother's cervical injury required another 6 weeks in the brace, but the neurological prognosis was good. She would recover full function. Edward arrived the week after my father was moved to rehab. I watched his entrance from the corridor, through the glass panel in the door. He was wearing a cashmere overcoat and carrying flowers, and the performance he put on for my parents over the following hour was genuinely impressive. The attentive son, the tearful reunion, the self-flagellation about not arriving sooner balanced carefully against explanations that made the delay sound like devotion to obligations he was carrying on their behalf. My mother held his hand the entire time. My father watched him with an expression I could not fully read. When I came in, the temperature in the room changed in the way that a room's temperature changes when the wrong person enters. My mother smiled at me, but the smile was the one she used for situations requiring management. Edward greeted me with an embrace that lasted exactly long enough to seem sincere and not 1 second longer. We were a family. We were performing being a family. We were all, in our various ways, lying. 3 days later, my parents called me in alone. My mother had a manila envelope in her lap. She held it out to me with both hands, which was difficult given the constraints of her brace, and said that there was some insurance paperwork that needed my signature to release funds from their homeowner's policy. Funds that were needed, she explained carefully, to cover some of the costs that had been accumulating. "What costs?" I asked. "Medical," she said, "and some other things. The lawyers can explain the details. It's just standard release authorization." I took the envelope. I opened it. I removed the documents inside. They were not insurance release forms. They were a retroactive power of attorney, granting Thomas and Helen White authority over my financial accounts, combined with a debt assumption agreement that incorporated, by reference, the full terms of the Kenai Capital Partners loan, including the $667,240 outstanding balance, the 21% interest rate, and the collateral provisions relating to the Kenai property. By signing these documents, I would have voluntarily assumed legal responsibility for a debt I had never contracted, using property I had already transferred to a trust they did not know existed. I read every page. I took my time. My mother watched me with the particular stillness of someone waiting to see which way an animal will run. When I finished, I set the papers down on the bedside table. I looked at my mother. I looked at my father, who was looking at the wall. "Where's Edward?" I asked. "He stepped out," my mother said. "Convenient." I reached into my jacket and took out my phone. "I need to show you something." I had texted Edward from the corridor 10 minutes before entering the room, telling him to come back in. He appeared in the doorway 60 seconds after I started speaking, which told me he had been just outside, waiting. I let him come in and close the door. Then I laid it out. I told them about the accident report and the mile marker. I told them about the laptop and the loan documents. I told them about my apartment, the safe, the empty mahogany case, and the 37 silver dollars that had belonged to my grandfather. I told them about Edward's office, the eviction notice, his annotated plan on the kitchen counter. I told them about the FTC complaint, the frozen accounts, the trust that now held the Kenai property in a form that no creditor could touch. And then I took out my phone, connected it to the room's Bluetooth speaker, the small portable one my mother had asked me to bring from her house so she could listen to audiobooks during recovery, and I played the dashcam recording. My father's voice filled the room. We should not have forged Arthur's name. My mother's face, which had been maintaining its composed, managing expression, shifted in a way I had never seen it shift. The composure did not crack. It receded, like a tide going out, leaving something older and harder underneath. We took his grandfather's coins. My father, in the hospital bed, turned his head away from the speaker. His jaw was working. He was not looking at anyone. "Arthur will never know. Stop whining and drive." I stopped the recording. What happened next is not what I expected, and it is the detail that, even now, I find most instructive about the nature of the family I was born into. Edward exploded. Not at me, at them. He stood in the corner of the recovery room and unleashed a fury that stripped away the cashmere coat and the espresso and every cultivated surface of the person he had constructed. And what was underneath was a man who was furious that his instruments had been careless. He was not angry that our parents had committed fraud. He was not angry about the coins or the forgery or the betrayal of a brother who had never done anything to warrant it. He was angry that the dashcam had not been disabled. He was angry that the IP trail had been traceable. He was angry that they had been sloppy, and that their sloppiness had cost him the operational breathing room he needed. "I cannot believe," he said, in a voice of low, deliberate contempt that I recognized as the voice he used when he believed he was the smartest person in a room, "that you people could not handle the logistics of a single transaction without turning it into a discoverable disaster." My mother looked at him. My father looked at him. Something moved between them, a recognition, slow and terrible, of a calculation that had been running for 30 years and was only now arriving at its answer. I put my phone back in my pocket. I reached into my jacket and removed a single document, a 2-page agreement that Miriam Tan had prepared, reviewed, and signed off on. "I'll keep this simple," I said. "Option 1, you both sign this document, which formally acknowledges the identity theft and forgery, assigns the Kenai Capital Partners debt entirely to you, and releases me from any current or future liability associated with the loan. In exchange, I don't take the dashcam recording to the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit, and I don't pursue criminal referrals through the Alaska AG's office. Option 2. I do both of those things, and all 3 of you navigate federal fraud charges." "You wouldn't," Edward said. "I already have an appointment scheduled," I said. "It's on Thursday. I can cancel it or I can keep it. That's your only variable." Edward looked at our parents. I watched him calculate, watched him assess whether, if they signed and took the liability, he could still find a path through his own exposure. I watched him decide that the answer was yes. I watched him decide to let them burn. "Sign it," he said to them. "It's the only way out." My mother picked up the pen first. Her hand, in the cervical brace was not entirely steady. She signed her name. She did not look at me. My father signed without speaking. He looked at the wall the entire time. What followed was not dramatic. Financial consequences rarely are. They are administrative, procedural, relentless, the bureaucratic working out of decisions made in moments of desperation or greed, transformed over months and years into the grinding machinery of consequence. My parents filed for Chapter 7 bankruptcy protection 4 months after signing the agreement. Their house in Wasilla, already mortgaged to its ceiling, was included in the liquidation. They moved to a 2-bedroom apartment in a complex outside Palmer on income that consisted almost entirely of early Social Security disbursement and a small disability stipend related to my mother's cervical injury. I know this not because they told me, but because bankruptcy filings are public record, and I am professionally fluent in public record. Edward's situation resolved itself with the pitiless efficiency of systems that have been designed specifically to catch what he had done. The Washington State Department of Revenue completed its audit and referred its findings to the state AG's office. Plea agreement was reached. Edward avoided prison. His lawyers were good, and he cooperated fully with the investigation into the investment fraud, which implicated several of his angel investors in their own misrepresentations, but he was ordered to repay $340,000 in misappropriated tax funds over a structured 7-year schedule, with garnishment provisions applied to his wages. The Seattle penthouse apartment was gone. The cashmere coat was, presumably, still somewhere. Last I heard, Edward was managing the morning shift at a coffee chain in Capitol Hill. I know this because a former colleague sent me a photograph, taken without malice, captioned simply, "Is this your brother?" I looked at the photograph for a moment, then deleted the message. I do not spend time thinking about Edward. My grandfather's coins came back to me through a process that took 11 weeks and required the assistance of a licensed pawnbroker recovery service that Miriam Tan recommended. The pawnshop in Seward where my parents had sold them for $4,200 I learned, which is what $22,000 worth of irreplaceable history looks like when you need cash today and can't afford to wait, had not yet sold the collection when I located it. I paid the buyback price, which was $6,800. I did not begrudge the margin. I carried the mahogany case back to Anchorage on my lap on the flight home, the way you carry something you were afraid you would never see again. The fraudulent loan agreement was formally voided by an Alaska Superior Court ruling 8 months after I filed the injunction. Kenai Capital Partners LLC attempted to argue that the forgery was an internal family matter that did not affect the validity of their lien, which is the kind of argument that sounds almost reasonable until a judge explains, in precise legal language, why it is not. The lien was extinguished. The Raymond White Legacy Trust remained intact. My grandfather's cabin stands on the bank of the Kenai exactly as he left it. I am sitting in it now as I write this final section. It is early October, which is the best time to be on the Kenai. The summer crowds are gone, the cottonwoods along the river have gone yellow, and the sockeye run is finished, so the bears have moved back into the hills. The coffee in my mug has gone slightly cold because I have been writing instead of drinking it, which is a habit I share with my grandfather, based on the evidence of the ring stains on every flat surface in this cabin. There are 4 people arriving tomorrow, friends from my firm, none of whom have any blood relation to me, all of whom have, in their various ways, shown up when they said they would. We are going to fish for Dolly Varden in the morning and cook them over the fire pit in the evening and drink the good whiskey I keep in the cabinet above the wood stove. It is not a complicated plan. It does not require anyone to perform or pretend. 18 months ago, I launched a boutique financial forensics practice, Arthur White Investigative Accounting, that focuses specifically on family financial abuse and estate fraud. It is the fastest growing part of my professional life. The caseload is not surprising. The cases are not abstract to me. When a client sits across from me and describes the moment they realized that the person they trusted most had been using their name, their property, their inheritance as raw material for someone else's survival, I understand what they mean in a way that goes below language. I do not speak to my parents. I do not speak to Edward. This is not a decision I revisit. It is not a wound I tend. It is simply the accurate map of a territory. These are people who exist in the world, and they are not in my world, and both of those things are true simultaneously without contradiction. My grandfather used to say when I asked him about people who had wronged him over the years, there had been some in a long life on a commercial fishing boat, that the river does not hold a grudge against the rock that split it. It just goes around, and eventually the rock wears down and the river is still there. I think about that sometimes, sitting in his chair in his cabin on his river, which is now mine. Outside, the cottonwoods are gold against the gray October sky. The river is moving with the low, steady sound that rivers make when the urgent season is over. The coins are in their case on the shelf above the wood stove, and the morning is quiet, and I am, in the most complete sense of the word I know how to mean, fine.